I have watched arrogant defendants challenge police officers, insult witnesses, and lie under oath without blinking. But there is a specific type of contempt that freezes a courtroom, the kind where a defendant looks at a decorated war veteran, a man who has quite literally sacrificed his body for the country, and mocks that very sacrifice as if it were a weakness to be exploited. That was the day I felt something I rarely allow myself to feel on the bench: pure, unadulterated anger. What Karen Cole did not understand was that the quiet man standing across from her had brought one piece of evidence into my courtroom. One devastating piece of evidence that would eventually make her regret every single word she had uttered in my presence. Let me take you back to the beginning of this ordeal. The plaintiff, Daniel Carter, entered my courtroom slowly. He was dressed in a dark blue suit that looked as though it had been hanging untouched in a closet for years, a relic of a life before the injury. He was tall, broad-shouldered, perhaps 50 years old, but pain has a way of adding decades to a man's face. His left hand stayed glued to his side, and every few steps, his right leg dragged slightly. Most observers would have seen the limp. I noticed the effort he took to hide it. He timed every movement, his shoulders remaining level even when his balance betrayed him. He refused to grab the wooden rail beside him, even when he teetered. That told me everything I needed to know about Daniel in 10 seconds flat. He didn't have vanity. He had the kind of pride a survivor develops after walking through fire. Across the aisle stood the defendant, Karen Cole. She was 38, sharply dressed in a fitted cream-colored jacket, dripping in expensive jewelry, wearing the faint, practiced smile of someone who viewed the judicial system as just another room she could easily dominate. Years on the bench teach you that confidence and innocence are rarely roommates. Innocent people have urgency. They want to be understood, they listen closely, and they react when facts are misstated. Karen did none of those things. She looked around my courtroom as though she were studying an audience. Then, she noticed Daniel's limp. Her eyes dropped toward his leg for less than a second, and the corner of her mouth lifted in a sneer. It was a tiny expression, one most people would miss. I did not. The dispute, according to the complaint, involved $18,000. Daniel claimed that Karen had collected this money on behalf of a nonprofit organization called Heroes Forward, an organization that supposedly provided emergency housing and medical assistance to veterans. Daniel had donated $5,000 of his own savings and helped organize a fundraising dinner where an additional $13,000 was raised. Then, the money disappeared. Karen insisted that Daniel had never donated anything personally and that the fundraiser had barely covered its own expenses. She claimed he was suing her simply because she had refused to make him the public spokesperson for the organization. She looked at me, completely composed, waiting for me to buy her lie. Arthur took a deep breath, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. He didn't start with the money. He started with the house. He described the structure, the meticulous way he had reinforced the foundation with his own materials because, as he put it, he couldn't stand the thought of a job being done poorly. It wasn't about the check. It was about the craft. He spoke about the guest house, not as a project, but as a commitment he had made to someone he thought valued quality. As he talked, Victoria's composure slipped just for a millisecond. She rolled her eyes, a sharp, audible sound that was meant to devalue everything he was saying. She looked at the ceiling as if she were waiting for a higher power to rescue her from this tedious display of working-class honesty. I watched the exchange closely. I saw her hand tighten into a fist beneath the table. She wasn't just bored, she was agitated. It was the agitation of a child who hates being forced to listen to someone they deem lesser. When she tried to interject, I didn't even let her finish the sentence. I put my hand up, my eyes locking onto hers with a stern warning. Miss Sterling, unless you want to spend the next hour in the hall, you will keep your mouth shut until I invite you to speak. Your arrogance is not a substitute for evidence in my courtroom. Do I make myself clear? She bristled, her back stiffening like a steel rod, but she nodded curtly. She knew better than to push me further, though the look in her eyes suggested she was already calculating how to get the last word. Arthur continued, his voice steadying, finding a rhythm in the truth. He produced a series of photographs from his briefcase. They were grainy, printed on cheap office paper, showing the progress of the renovation. But they told a story of precision electrical work, insulation, custom molding that looked like it belonged in a museum, not a guest house. Victoria scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed through the room. Those don't prove anything, Judge. Anyone can take a picture of a construction site and claim it's their own work. He's clearly a hack who got in over his head. I looked at the photos, then back at her, feeling that familiar tightening in my chest. You're right, Miss Sterling. Anyone can take a picture. But you hired a man with 30 years of experience, a man who, according to your own emails, which, by the way, have been entered into evidence, you praised as a visionary just 4 months ago. So, unless he suddenly lost his vision and his skill overnight, I'm struggling to see how his work became abysmal the moment the final payment was due. The courtroom went quiet. The air grew heavy, the kind of stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. Victoria stiffened. She hadn't expected me to read the emails. That was the first crack in the foundation of her smugness. She tried to pivot, claiming the emails were just polite pleasantries, but her voice had lost its crisp, rehearsed edge. She was starting to realize that this wasn't going to be the quick, dismissive victory she had walked in expecting. Arthur, for his part, was looking at the photos, his eyes softening. He wasn't looking for a win in the sense of power. He was simply looking for the respect he had been denied for months. I watched as he laid out the next piece of documentation, a logbook of hours. This case was no longer just a dispute over $25,000. It was rapidly becoming a battle for the dignity of a man who had been used, discarded, and insulted by a woman who thought money made her immune to the law. And I was just getting started. I looked at the invoices Arthur laid out. They were detailed, professional, and entirely legitimate. Victoria, however, was shifting in her chair. The initial smugness was beginning to evaporate, replaced by a frantic, defensive energy. She started flipping through her own documents, her movements becoming jerky and imprecise. I decided to press her on the substandard work claim. Miss Sterling, you've used that term 3 times now. Tell me, exactly which part of a master-crafted renovation is substandard? Was the foundation off? Were the electrical circuits improper? She stammered. It was the first time she hadn't had a smooth, rehearsed answer ready. It was just to the aesthetic. It wasn't what I envisioned. It was clunky. Clunky. The word hung in the air, heavy and insulting. Arthur flinched, and I saw the hurt in his eyes, not because she didn't like the color of the paint, but because she was attacking his life's work with the casual cruelty of someone who never had to build anything with their own hands. Clunky, I repeated, my voice ice cold. Mr. Vance, I've reviewed your portfolio, and your reputation for precision is well documented. Miss Sterling, I have here a text message thread retrieved from Mr. Vance's phone dated just 2 weeks before the project was halted. You wrote to him, and I quote, "The guest house looks incredible. I love the finish on the molding." End quote. If the work was so clunky, why were you praising it just 14 days before you decided not to pay him? The room went absolutely silent. Victoria froze. Her face flushed a deep, indignant red. That was out of context. I was being nice. I didn't want to discourage him before he finished. The audacity was staggering. She treated a human being like a light switch, toggling between praise and condemnation, depending on whether it served her wallet. I didn't let her get away with it. I leaned over the bench, looking at her as if she were a bug I was considering squashing. You were being nice? This is a court of law, Miss Sterling. We deal in contracts, in work performed, and in payment owed. We do not deal in your social manipulations or your convenient lies. Mr. Vance, is this the only text message you have? Arthur hesitated, then reached into his folder. He pulled out a printed transcript of a voicemail. Your Honor, she left this message the day after she fired me. She didn't mention my work. She mentioned her bank account. I gestured for the officer to bring it to me. The transcript was short, but it contained the kind of arrogance that makes my blood boil. It wasn't about the house. It was about power. It was about a woman who believed that because she had money, she could rewrite the terms of a contract whenever the mood struck her. I looked up at the gallery, then back to Victoria. The facade was crumbling. She wasn't the untouchable queen of the estate anymore. She was just a liar caught in the spotlight of the truth. Victoria Sterling's performance was falling apart. She was no longer the poised socialite. She was a cornered animal, darting her eyes toward the exit, then back to the evidence table. I watched her closely. In this business, you don't just look at the evidence to see if it's real. You look at the defendant to see if they fear it. And Karen, or Victoria, as she was realizing her identity in my courtroom was being stripped away, was absolutely terrified. Your Honor, she hissed, her voice lacking its previous polish. This is ridiculous. He's trying to assassinate my character. None of this is relevant. Relevance is not for you to decide. Miss Sterling, I snapped, my gavel striking the bench with a definitive crack that sent a shudder through the room. I decide what is relevant, and right now, the relevance of your credibility is hitting rock bottom. Arthur, present the evidence? Arthur Vance, his hands still trembling slightly, produced the flash drive. It sat on the table like a live grenade. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Victoria lunged forward, her hand outstretched, but my bailiff was faster, stepping between her and the evidence. Don't you dare, I warned. You touch that, and you will be in contempt before you can blink. You wanted your day in court, and you are going to get every second of it. It wasn't just the money anymore. The look on Victoria's face was that of someone whose entire house of cards was about to be blown over. She looked at the flash drive as if it were a bomb. I looked at Arthur, and for a moment, the age and the pain in his face vanished. He looked like the soldier he had once been. He knew what was on that drive, and he knew that for the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving, he was winning. Victoria, meanwhile, was frantically whispering to her own reflection in the mahogany table, muttering excuses that nobody was listening to. She thought she was the smartest person in the room. She thought she was untouchable. She was about to learn that in this courtroom, there is no amount of money or status that can silence the truth when it decides to speak up. I signaled the technician to load the drive. The screen behind me flickered to life. The game was over. The technician tapped a few keys. The courtroom screen flickered a burst of static, then a clear, crisp waveform appeared. Your Honor, please, Victoria whispered, her voice finally cracking under the pressure. She wasn't just nervous anymore. She was visibly unraveling. Her composure, which had been her only shield for the last hour, was gone. I ignored her, keeping my gaze locked on the screen. I was watching Arthur. He sat there, his shoulders finally dropping from his ears, waiting for the truth to be validated. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for vindication. The audio began to play. It was a recorded phone call, clear as a bell. One voice was Victoria's, unmistakable in its cold, transactional tone. The other was a man's, presumably a business associate or a co-conspirator. The work is perfect, Victoria's voice projected through the courtroom speakers, sounding nothing like the indignant woman standing before me. It's high-end, top-tier, exactly what we need to maximize the appraisal value before the sale. But he's an old man, he doesn't know the market value. Just stiff him on the final payment. If he sues, drag it out in court. He's a laborer. He doesn't have the stomach for a long legal battle. By the time he realizes what's happening, I'll have already sold the estate and moved the funds offshore. The room erupted into a low, stunned murmur. I didn't even need to bang my gavel to restore order. The shock in the gallery was immediate. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. I turned my head slowly toward the defendant. Victoria looked like she had just seen a ghost. Her hands were gripping the table so hard her knuckles were bone white. The abysmal work, the clunky aesthetic, it was all a calculated performance designed to save money by exploiting an honest man's labor. She had played him, counting on the fact that she viewed him as insignificant. Is that your voice, Miss Sterling? I asked. The question was a formality. I already knew the answer. She looked up, trapped, the veneer of wealth and social standing stripped away in an instant. She was no longer the untouchable queen of the estate. She was just a small, dishonest person caught in the harsh light of her own greed. She opened her mouth, her lips trembling. That's not, she started, but the words died in her throat. She couldn't even manage a coherent lie anymore. It's not what? I pressed, leaning over the bench, my eyes narrowed. An incredible job? An increase in appraisal value? Or is it not the voice of a woman who thought she could treat a man's livelihood like a bargain bin purchase? I didn't give her a chance to recover. This wasn't just a breach of contract anymore. It was a character assassination of a man who worked for a living. And in my courtroom, that is a sin I do not tolerate. The recording ended, but the silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the kind of silence born of confusion. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total realization. Everyone in that room, from the bailiff to the stenographer, knew that the woman in the charcoal suit had just been burned to the ground by her own arrogance. She sat there, her hands trembling so violently that the expensive bracelets on her wrists clinked against the table like funeral bells. That is an AI fabrication, she whispered, though the strength had completely drained from her voice. She wasn't trying to convince me anymore. She was trying to convince herself. She grabbed her phone, her fingers dancing frantically over the screen, likely reaching out to the powerful connections she thought were her insurance policy. I need to call my father. He has the right people to handle this. You can't do this to me. I am the lead donor to the courthouse renovation fund. I didn't blink. I didn't even shift in my chair. Miss Sterling, I said, my voice echoing, you could donate the entire gross domestic product of a small nation to this courthouse, and it wouldn't change the fact that you have just been caught red-handed in a conspiracy to defraud veterans and obstruct justice. Your father's influence stops at the door of my courtroom. In fact, if he had any sense, he would be as ashamed of your behavior today as I am. As if on cue, the courtroom doors swung open. A man walked in, older, distinguished, wearing a suit that commanded respect. This was her father, the man whose name she had used like a weapon for the last hour. He stopped, looking at the screen where Victoria's own voice was being archived as evidence. Then he looked at his daughter. He didn't rush to her side. He didn't offer a hand. He stood there, watching the woman who had thought her name made her untouchable, and his expression shifted from concern to a cold, hard realization. He saw the flash drive, he saw the look on my face, and he saw the ruin of everything he had built his reputation on. He didn't speak. He just walked to the front row, sat down, and folded his hands. He had come here to save his daughter, but the evidence was screaming louder than his influence ever could. He chose not to defend the indefensible. The message was clear. Victoria was on her own. Mr. Vance, I said, turning my attention back to the plaintiff, who was witnessing the collapse of his tormentor with a quiet, stoic dignity. Do you have anything else to add before we proceed with the formal referral to the district attorney's office? Arthur stood, his bad leg causing him a visible struggle, but he didn't care. He looked at the father, then at Victoria. I just wanted my money back for the heroes she used. I wanted her to know that my brothers in arms aren't just names on a document she can forge. She will know, I said. She will have plenty of time to reflect on that. I looked down at Victoria, who was now weeping, not out of remorse, but out of the sheer terror of losing her status. Court is in recess. Officer, ensure the defendant remains in the building. We aren't finished yet. Victoria's frantic gaze darted toward her father, a final, desperate plea for salvation. Dad, tell them this is a misunderstanding. You know I would never do something like this. Please, use your influence. Her father did not rush to her side. He did not offer a comforting hand. Instead, he stood slowly, his movements deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who had just seen his life's work, his reputation, shattered by the person he loved most. He walked toward the bench, his eyes fixed on Arthur Vance, not his daughter. He looked at Arthur, really looked at him, not as a laborer or a contract worker, but as a man who had been deeply wronged. Your Honor, he began, his voice deep, gravelly, and stripped of all vanity. I raised my daughter to believe that hard work and integrity were the foundations of a good life. I failed. I see that now, clearer than I ever have. The courtroom held its collective breath. Victoria seemed to shrink in her chair, her face turning from red to a ghostly shade of white. Her father turned toward her, his expression one of profound, crushing disappointment. You used your name to bully people you thought were beneath you. You used this man's struggle to enrich yourself, and when you were caught, you tried to drag me into your web of lies to save your own skin. That is not who we are. That is not who you were raised to be. He turned back to me, his posture straight, his eyes resolute. I want to pay Mr. Vance the full amount owed, plus interest. And I want to make a substantial, anonymous donation to his Veteran Support Fund. Not to buy my daughter's freedom, she must face the consequences of her choices, but to restore the honor that she has so carelessly trampled. I watched Arthur. The tension that had held his shoulders hostage for the entire proceeding finally broke. He didn't smile, but he stood taller. For the first time, he looked like a man who had won a war he wasn't even sure he was fighting. Miss Sterling, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, stagnant air of the courtroom. You spent this entire proceeding attempting to belittle a man who has done more for this country in a single day than you have in your entire pampered existence. You believed your name was a shield against the truth. You believed your wealth made you immune to accountability. You were dead wrong. Judgment is for the plaintiff in the full amount of $25,000, including legal fees, to be paid immediately. Furthermore, I am forwarding these recordings and the transcripts of today's proceedings to the district attorney's office. You are not just facing a civil judgment, Miss Sterling. You are facing the criminal consequences of your actions. Victoria collapsed into her chair, her head sinking into her hands. The armor of privilege had been stripped away, leaving only the cold reality of her own making. Her father didn't say another word to her. He simply bowed his head toward me and walked out, leaving his daughter to face the wreckage of her own arrogance alone. The deputies approached Victoria. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She simply went limp, the weight of the moment finally anchoring her to reality. As they led her out through the side door, the same door used for those who have lost more than just a legal battle, she didn't look back at the father who had washed his hands of her. She was a woman who had built an identity on the shifting sands of vanity and privilege, and now that structure had collapsed under the gravity of the truth. I turned my attention to Arthur. He was still standing by his table, gathering his papers. The tremor in his hands was gone, replaced by a steady, quiet resolve. I didn't need to offer him platitudes. He knew what he had achieved. As he walked toward the exit, he paused and gave a single, respectful nod toward the bench. It was a gesture of acknowledgement between two people who understood that justice isn't always swift, but when it arrives, it is unmistakable. The gallery cleared out, the murmurs of the spectators lingering like smoke in the air. I sat there for a long moment, watching the empty chair where Victoria had sat once so confident, now just an empty space in a courtroom that has seen thousands of such falls. People often come into this room asking for money, for vindication, or for an apology, but what they are really looking for is recognition. They want to be seen. They want the truth, the version of events that they have held on to through sleepless nights and quiet despair, to be validated by the highest authority in the room. Victoria Sterling believed she could obscure that truth with a veneer of status. She thought that if she could make Arthur feel small, she would, by extension, feel bigger. She didn't realize that in my courtroom, the only size that matters is the size of your integrity. This case, like so many others, serves as a harsh reminder. Character is what remains when power fails. You can build a fortress around your life with influence, money, and arrogance, but a single crack of truth can bring it all down. Accountability is the great equalizer. It doesn't care about your pedigree, your bank account, or the car you drove to court in. It only cares about the truth, and eventually, the truth always wins. For those watching at home, if you think you can walk through life treating people like stepping stones, look at this case. Remember the look on her face when the recording played. That isn't a face you want to wear. True strength is not in how much you can take from others. It is in how you treat those who have nothing to offer you but their humanity. And if you think you are untouchable, think again. Justice has a way of finding you, no matter how high you've built your walls.